Tonight, I'm working on a modern art piece because quilting can be elevated. You know, like up off the bed and on the wall. I'm gonna make a flying geese graphic modern wall hanging, and then I'm gonna quilt it to death. So let's get to it. Fail. Tonight, I'm making the Falling Ombre quilt designed by Natalie Crabtree, and I'm very excited because this quilt is going to hang in a very exclusive exhibit with multi-generational artists. This is my first time having such a high-profile piece, so I'm gonna do my very best to piece it perfectly and quilt it with some fun designs. But before I can do that, I've gotta cut into this beautiful fabric, so let's get to it. I'm gonna cut the fabric into strips and then cut the strips into squares. I'm gonna cut the square diagonally twice to make 4 triangles, and that's gonna be my flying geese block. And I'm gonna repeat to do that with the other colors that's gonna give this quilt a shaded look. So I've cut out all my triangles of the different shades of blue, and that's where we're gonna see that shaded effect, that ombre look come out. Now I'm gonna cut up the background fabric to make the rest of my blocks, and then we'll start piecing. This pattern doesn't make flying geese 4 at a time or 2 at a time, we make them 1 at a time. And that's because there's so many different sized blocks. I've laid out 3 of them so you can get an idea of the range of sizes. And one thing I want to point out is that when I start cutting that fabric on the diagonal, I start getting a bias stretch. As you can see, when I pull those ends apart, that bias gives it a little stretch, and it's really easy to piece it out of shape and have a distorted flying geese block. And I mean, I think it could be fine, but I want it to be perfect for this exhibit. So I'm gonna get some starch and actually starch all these blocks before I piece them together to help it hold its shape. And as I press, I'm just pushing down, I'm not sliding it across because I don't want to stretch out those pieces. And then as it dries, it's gonna hold its shape a lot easier and be a lot easier to piece with. Now that they're all nice and flat and starched, I'm gonna start sewing together. So I'm gonna start with the littlest one, folding over the first triangle, sewing it together with a 1/4 inch seam, and then pressing it open before I add the other side. Remembering to pat the fabric so that I don't stretch out that block, and do the same on the other side, pulling it over together. This bottom corner is gonna line up, and this top one's gonna extend past it, which is good because that's what's gonna give me that 1/4 inch seam allowance for when I put it together. So quick 1/4 inch seam, I'll have the first of many flying geese blocks done. So I'm eventually gonna have to come back and trim up this flying geese, but I'm gonna go ahead and do these other 2 the same way I assembled the first one, and then trim them all up together. So as I'm trimming the flying geese blocks, I want to be careful that I leave that 1/4 inch between the point and the edge of my block. That might mean I need to trim a little bit off both sides, but the result will be those nice, perfectly pieced points that are exhibit worthy. So I'm going to keep trimming these up, and then we'll see the row come together. And just like I did on the long side, I want to make sure that point is centered in the block. So again, I might have to trim some off both sides, but I want to make sure that that flying geese is right in the center of the block. So these 3 flying geese blocks are pieced, pressed, and perfect for our exhibit. But the way the pattern goes together is they look like they're kind of falling in different placement. And we're gonna use background fabric to make that happen. So some of the flying geese units won't have any background strips sewn to them. They're big and beautiful enough on their own. Some of them will get a strip on one side or the other. So for this medium size, I'm gonna put a strip to one side, and you can tell it's already gonna make it offset a bit. Now the smallest ones will actually get 2 on each side, and that's gonna help build it up. So I'm gonna assemble these blocks, and then we'll see the first row of falling ombre come together. As I'm pressing those strips, I don't have to be quite as worried because there's no more bias to my blocks. However, I am making sure to press them away from the dark, and I know that sounds kind of crazy. What I want is to make these points nice and easy to quilt. And so by keeping the bulk away from those points is gonna make that easier. However, using this white background means that if any of this dark fabric is hanging over the seam, it's gonna be noticeable. So before I start assembling my quilt, I just do a quick little check and make sure I don't have any of the dark fabric hanging over the white. If that darker fabric was extending past the white, or I could really see it outside of that seam, I'm gonna take a pair of scissors and just kind of trim it up. That way when I quilt it, you don't see it hanging out underneath the fabric. So if you've watched me on the Midnight Quilt Show for any amount of time, you know that perfectionism isn't really my thing. Close enough is good enough. Finished is better than perfect, you know, all that stuff. But this is gonna go in an exhibit. It's gonna hang with other artists, and I wanna do my very, very best. Plus, it's a small quilt, so it's not a big commitment to check all those points. Okay, so now we're gonna lay out the first column of the quilt. So I've laid out my flying geese blocks, and you can see the different sizes and the different placements really make it look like it's moving. It's definitely giving this quilt a bit of movement that I can't wait to highlight with the machine quilting. And then in between the blocks, I'm gonna add a strip of background fabric. We're gonna spread these flying geese blocks out just a bit so I get a little room. So I'm gonna start assembling these together, and I'm gonna do that by sewing that strip to each one of my flying geese units. But here's where I want to try to pay a little bit of attention to make sure that I'm getting that perfectly pieced point, so that as I make my way across with my 1/4 inch seam, I can see exactly where that point will be, and I'm going to try to make it as close to that as I can. Since I'm sewing it together with background fabric, if I make it a little farther off, that's fine, but I definitely don't want to cut off that point because that would be noticeable. So I'm going to sew the strips to each of the blocks, and then sew all those blocks together, and I'll have the first column all finished. And look at that pretty point. I'm not saying I'll ever be a perfectionist, but this does feel pretty good to have some nice piecing. Okay, well, I'm gonna continue this and we'll see what it looks like when I'm done. So the first column of my falling ombre quilt is finished, and I think what's really cool about this pattern is you can start to see the movement of those triangles, and as they turn different colors and different sizes, and I'm gonna pull in the other 2 columns so you can get an idea of what this exhibit-worthy piece is gonna look like. So the next column is exactly the same, but to keep it interesting, I'm gonna flip it upside down. Well, I'm not going to, the pattern tells me to, but you can see now I'm getting it going both directions, and the last column is the same as the first. I'm gonna sew these 3 columns together, and what's awesome is there's no matching points to worry about. But I am gonna pay extra close attention to the sides of some of those flying geese because I don't wanna chop off those points either. Well, I'm gonna get this sewn together and we're gonna see what it looks like when it's all finished. And my falling ombre wall hanging is almost finished. I think it needs a little bit of a frame, so I'm gonna add a border with the same background fabric. To make sure that my borders go on perfect-ish, I'm gonna fold my border in half and find the center. I'm gonna fold it, give it a little crease with my fingers, and then align it with the center of my block. And that's just gonna help keep me from sewing it and stretching it. It's gonna make sure that border fits perfectly. And then I'm gonna clip it from the center out on both sides. So I'm gonna sew the border on the top and the bottom, press, add the side borders, and then it'll be time to make my quilt sandwich and start quilting. Speaking of quilt sandwich, let me show you what the piece backing looks like. It's a great way to use up the scraps left over from making the blocks, plus it adds a little bit of an artistic flair, if I do say so myself. Okay, well, I'm gonna get this ready to go, and then it's time for the machine quilting. Since the name of this quilt is Falling Ombre, I think I'm gonna pick designs with a lot of movement, a lot of texture, and just have a lot of fun quilting it. I think I've got the perfect palette for my quilting, so now I just have to make it exhibit worthy. So I'm gonna get started. Within the blocks, I'm gonna keep it a little geometric with some dot-to-dot quilting. Starting from one corner, I'm gonna quilt a V that goes out and back, ending directly across from where I started. Then I'm gonna echo that V a couple more times to fill in half the triangle. I'm gonna do the same on the other side, quilting that V and echoing it, and that's gonna bring me right back to where I started. The result is a geometric design that really fills in that block. Then I'm gonna use the quilting to group these blocks together. So traveling along the seam, I'm gonna do some more V's that connect the outer points of my triangle and echo back to where I started. Using a slightly contrasting thread color is really gonna help the quilting group those blocks together. And I'm gonna keep doing that along the whole group of triangles, but for now, I'm gonna switch threads, get a thread that matches a little bit more, and do some wavy lines and pebbles in the center of my quilt. Starting from one point of my triangle, I'm gonna quilt a wavy line to the opposite side. Once I get to the edge of the quilt, I'm gonna travel across and echo the line I've just quilted. I really wanna build up these echo lines because it's gonna add a lot of movement to my quilt. I'll travel along the edge of my quilting at this point and add another echo line. Once I get to the edge of my quilt, I'm gonna travel over a couple inches and quilt another wavy line, leaving a gap in between the first wavy line. Now I could make this go all the way to the other edge, but I'm actually going to stop about halfway and quilt a serpentine line that comes back to that point where I started. Eventually I'll come in and hook these in together, and this is just going to make it a lot easier to quilt. I'm going to quilt serpentine lines going from one wavy line to the other and work my way back towards the edge of the quilt. These serpentine lines will have the same spacing as my wavy lines, but it's going to have a slight difference in direction, which will make them stand out just a bit in the background. I'm going to keep quilting those until I get to the edge of my quilt, and I think I'll just echo my way back up to my triangle point. In the space between the wavy lines and my triangle, I'm going to fill it with some dense quilting. Now, I don't always quilt pebbles and tiny swirls and paisleys in my quilts, but this is going to be a great way to smash down this area and make the blocks in the wavy lines stand out. I'm just combining a bunch of different designs, swirls, paisleys, and pebbles. It really doesn't matter what I quilt in here as long as it's pretty consistent. I'm loving the different textures of the quilting. I'm having a lot of fun quilting all these different designs. So I'm going to continue quilting my falling ombre quilt. I'm going to quilt it, bind it, put a hanging sleeve on it because it's for an exhibit. And if you want to learn how to add a hanging sleeve to your quilt, check out the description box below because we have a video link to Kelly Ashton's class where she shows you how to do it. All right, so I'm going to get to it and get this quilt ready to hang on the wall. This graphic, modern quilt is finished, and seeing it up on the wall really makes me feel like a true artist. Experimenting with the shades of colored fabric, getting those perfect points, and of course adding the best texture with machine quilting. Wavy lines that add movement, some serpentine lines, and of course quilting lots of different designs together really takes this art piece and elevates it up off the bed and onto the wall. Seeing it hang with my children's artwork in the Walters Family Gallery made all the effort worth it. Be sure to tune in next week for a bonus video where I give you tips on how to make your quilt look better even after it's finished. Happy quilting!